Creeks to the Sea Forum on Marine Debris, and this is part of our Creek Week event series this year. My name is Cameron Benson, and I'm the Creeks Manager for the City of Santa Barbara. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear our speakers and to learn more about this important topic. So what is marine debris? Simply put, marine debris is trash that gets out into the ocean. When you look around and you see trash along the streets and the highway and parking lots or on the beaches, you're looking at marine debris that's waiting to happen. Trash goes into the storm drains and then into the creeks and then is washed out into the ocean. The city's Creeks Division, with help from community groups and many local residents, spends some of its time cleaning trash or future marine debris out of our creeks and storm drains and off our beaches before it gets washed out to sea. In fact, this fall, before the winter rains come, we will walk the entire lengths of all the major creeks in Santa Barbara to remove every piece of trash that we can find. So the questions we have tonight are, what happens to all of the trash from all over the world that does get into the ocean? Where does it all go? What are the impacts to wildlife and to the marine environment? And maybe, most importantly, what can we do about it? We're very fortunate to have with us tonight two individuals that will help us answer those questions. Holly Lohais and Dr. Marcus Erickson are two of the leading experts on marine debris in the world. Both have traveled out into the middle of the ocean, into the North Pacific Gyre, near the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, to see where this debris ends up and to witness firsthand its impacts on wildlife and to research its impacts on water quality and to the marine environment. We've scheduled some time for questions and answers after both of our speakers have given their presentations. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Holly Lohais, an education associate with the Santa Barbara-based Ocean Futures Society. Holly is a member of the Ocean Futures Society expedition team. She's a marine biologist and naturalist with expertise in both coral reef and Channel Islands ecology. She has been part of Jean-Michel Cousteau's team for more than a decade, diving and exploring sensitive ecosystems and even conducting interactive live dive underwater broadcasts from remote regions around the world. Her travels have taken her from the cold waters of Alaska to the clear waters of the South Pacific and the pristine reefs of the Indian Ocean. As we will soon see, she has also spent some time in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. Please join me in welcoming Holly Lohais.
Wow, that's my job. That's always very nice. Thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be here this evening. As Cameron mentioned, my name is Holly. I'm with Jean-Michel Cousteau's Ocean Futures Society, and Jean-Michel Cousteau lives here in Santa Barbara. He absolutely loves the Santa Barbara community and would be here with us tonight, but he does spend 99% of his time on the road traveling around and promoting our mission of Ocean Futures Society, which is really spreading the word of ocean conservation. And most importantly, what can we do as an individual to make a difference? I have many coworkers here tonight with Sandra Squires, Nancy Keltner, Karen Keltner in the back. So please, we are here available with a lot of our information and literature and are very excited to be a part of this really important week, Creeks Week. So thank you very much for the invitation. And as the introduction mentioned, we had a wonderful opportunity to base one of our expeditions in one of the most remote island chains in the world, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. I have a support assistance here, so thank you. The northwestern Hawaiian Islands are pretty much off the main map of the Hawaiian Islands for most people. When we think of Hawaii, we think, of course, of the main Hawaiian Islands, of the Big Island, and Honolulu, Oahu, and Kauai. But past Kauai are 1,200 miles of small little islands and atolls that stretch in the northwest direction. Jean-Michel has always been intrigued by these island chain because of the uniqueness of the fragility of the coral reef ecosystem, but most importantly, next slide, the remoteness of these islands. If you stretch this island chain across the continental U.S., you could see it's a very large geographic area, and most recently has become the largest marine protected area in the world. Next slide. From this map, you could see these islands truly are one of the most remote island chains, pretty much smack in the middle of the Pacific, and pretty much equal distance between Asia and North America. And for us, it was an opportunity to really document just the beauty and the fragility of these island ecosystems. It was a team of 22 of us that set out on a research vessel from Honolulu in the summer of 2003. We had a terrestrial film team and an underwater film team, and we landed on 7 of these islands and dove on some of the most remote reefs that don't even come ashore. The atolls did not even break the surface. And we were diving with Dr. Jim Maragos, who's a coral reef biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we were put on location in many areas and diving on reefs that have never been explored before. We were documenting the uniqueness of these islands, and islands in general have a high percentage of endemic species, especially the terrestrial ecosystem. Even our own local Channel Islands have unique species that are found nowhere else around the world because of the fact of the isolation. Well, the Hawaiian Islands, being so isolated in the North Pacific, has over 25% of their 7,000 marine species that are found only around the Hawaiian Islands. We found species that are unique and very rare, not so much of the yellow tang, but the slide before, the masked angelfish and the Hawaiian grouper. That masked angelfish around the main Hawaiian Islands is found in fairly deep depths, generally depths deeper than 300 feet. But by the time we got out to Midway and Kure, we were seeing dozens and dozens of masked angelfish in water shallower than 30 feet. Because of its rarity, it is a prized fish in the aquarium trade, and people will pay up to $5,000 for this fish. But now with the new protection of the largest marine protected area, we're ensuring the protection of the masked angelfish, as well as the Hawaiian grouper, which is the only grouper species in Hawaii. We found in these islands just the abundance of high species, not so much the diversity that the Indo-Pacific reefs are known for, but high abundance of species. Next slide. And one of the uniqueness, of course, is just the pristine opportunity to look at the coral reef ecosystem. Of course, the coral reef is one of the most beautiful, diverse, ecologically complex ecosystems on this planet, and it definitely rivals some of the greatest, largest rainforests such as the Amazon. But unlike the terrestrial Amazon, where you have to search and you hear things but you don't necessarily see a lot of wildlife, you put a mask on and you jump into clear waters on the coral reefs and you're just amazed at the color and sizes of the diversity of species that we see. So we knew diving and documenting the coral reefs around the northwestern Hawaiian Islands would be helping and assisting the different researchers out there that are trying to gauge the baseline and collecting baseline information so they could help determine change that is happening on coral reefs on a global scale. Coral reefs today, over 25% of them are considered degraded or depleted. So diving on some of these really healthy, pristine marine environments gave us an opportunity to assist in some of the scientific studies going on. One of the exciting parts of our dives was a high percentage of apex predators. It's very rare this day and age in many different areas of the world is to see high numbers of large predators. And on pretty much every single dive we did, we have large schools of jacks and sharks and amberjacks that were a part of our dive team. In the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, about over 50% of the fish biomass are these large apex predators, compared to the main Hawaiian Islands where the same trophic level species only makes up about 3% of the fish population. So we knew this was a wonderful opportunity to look at an ecosystem pretty much well intact here in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It gave us an incredible opportunity to get very close to some of the more feared marine animals, of course sharks. And personally had one of the most memorable experiences of free diving with over 200 Galapagos sharks at Maro Reef. And you don't get to do that at very many places around the world. So a wonderful opportunity to look at these animals, to better understand them, and really appreciate the ecological role of value that they play within these ecosystems. We were able to film and document some very unique night feeding behavior, such as the Galapagos sharks feeding at night. And given the technology of the rebreathers that many of our divers were wearing, our dive team was able to stay down for up to 3 hours at a time to really get some spectacular footage. These islands because of their remoteness and because the fact that there's very few people out there, they're a very important sanctuary, very important nesting area for some of the more endangered species today, including the green sea turtle. The Hawaii population is unique to the Hawaiian Islands, and about 90, if you've been to the main Hawaiian Islands and you've seen a green sea turtle, most likely it was hatched out at the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. 90% of the green sea turtles are born on the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And they're one of the many remarkable comeback stories of a protected species. And since their protection in the late 70s, their population has increased over 600%. And that's some of the studies that have been done at French Frigate Shoals on a tiny little island called East Island, where a very well-known scientist started documenting the population back in the early 70s and counted 67 nesting females on the small little island. Over 3 decades later, the last count that I read was over 400 nesting females on this tiny little sandy beach. So they're doing very well and one of the many success stories of the Hawaiian Islands. Unfortunately, it's not the same story for the most critically endangered of the marine mammals, especially the pinnipeds or the seals and sea lions. The Hawaiian monk seal population is still continuing to decline, and it's very puzzling for the experts and the biologists. Not sure if it's food-related, habitat degradation, but because of the remoteness of these islands, you think with their protection, the population would increase. But we're not seeing that, and it's still one of the many unanswered questions and really the efforts that have gone on by multi-agencies to try to better understand. The humpback whales are one of many different cetacean species, cetaceans being the whales and dolphins found around the world, and there's a large number of cetaceans that will spend part of their year or all of the year around the Hawaiian Islands. The humpback whales depend on the remoteness of the Hawaiian Islands, of course, during the winter months where the females come specifically to give birth, and a very important nurturing area in the shallow waters and warm tropical waters. Just this last winter, a paper was published where they believe there's more and more breeding and birthing activity of humpback whales around the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So, of course, there's a marine sanctuary designated around the main Hawaiian Islands, and now they feel very optimistic that as the population continues to increase, that they're utilizing more and more of the shallow habitats of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. But it's the seabirds that are found en masse of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, probably the most important seabird rookery in the world. Over 14 million seabirds are found on these islands, at least half of them breeding on an annual basis, of about 21 different species of seabirds. So it's because of the remoteness and lack of terrestrial predators that make these islands very, very important for a variety of seabird species, including this beautiful brown noddy. We saw many different seabirds. In fact, some of the islands we spent the night on, we had to wear earplugs because it was so noisy. And some birds that are quiet during the day come out at night. So you have the nightlife that is just as noisy as the day life. And one of the more active and fun birds to watch are the red-footed boobies. And like many of these seabirds, they could fly a great distance from the islands to feed and also depend on the nutrient-rich waters around these islands for feeding opportunities. Sort of the robbers of the sky are the frigate birds, and one of the larger birds that we saw. In fact, there's a population of female frigate birds on one of the small islands of French Frigate Shoals that specializes specifically in eating seabird chicks. And so they really adapt to the conditions that they're in, and given the high abundance of chicks, they've learned to feed directly on one species of chick. But otherwise, frigate birds love to chase down other birds in the air and will harass them to a point that the other birds, such as a booby, will regurgitate their delicious squid or fish meal, regurgitate it in the air, and the frigate bird will take it right from the air. So spectacular aerial acrobats that we watched with these birds. And of course, these birds were very curious of us. There's not a lot of people that go out to these remote islands. This is our land cameraman, Antoine, who had a sooty tern landing on his head. And these sooty terns are the most abundant of the seabirds out there. And they were all over the place. And unlike most seabirds, they actually don't do very well landing on the surface of the ocean. So they could be out at sea for months at a time, but they will not land on the surface. So you could only imagine when they find a tiny little speck of an island in the middle of the Pacific, any location to land on, I'm sure, is quite a restful relief, such as the top of our cameraman or the mic of our sound engineer. So those are beautiful sooty terns. Next picture. But the kings and the queens of these northwestern Hawaiian Islands when it comes to the nesting seabirds are, of course, the albatrosses. And there's 2 different species and high numbers on these islands. In fact, 95% of the population of Laysan albatrosses and black-footed albatrosses nest on these islands, numbering in the hundreds of thousands of birds. They're also called the goonie bird, and in a minute I'll show a short little clip of one of our films, and you can see why they're called the goonie bird and the way that they waddle or walk, and also when they land. They're pretty awkward after being out at sea for days, if not weeks, if not months at a time. When they come in for landing, it's sometimes a little crash landing there. But these albatrosses depend on the nutrient-rich colder waters in the North Pacific, so they fly great distances in search for food for their chicks. And 5 months of the first 5 months of the chick's life, they are completely dependent on their parents bringing back nutrients from the surface of the ocean hundreds of miles away. That's the juvenile going through its phase of losing its first feathers and getting its flight feathers. The black albatross also nest in high numbers on the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Both of these species are very vulnerable to longline fishing, and I just read an article 2 days ago that we're considering listing this species as a threatened species because of the decline in number, mainly due to one type of fishery where they're very vulnerable. But, next slide. But these birds also are very vulnerable, unfortunately, to what lays beyond the horizon, and it's not a direct pollution problem from the islands, but it comes from places as far away as California. And as these animals fly across the Great Pacific, both up towards Alaska and even over towards Asia, they're flying over what is now considered today sort of the pollution highway of the North Pacific. And I know Marcus will go into great details of what they have discovered out in the Pacific, which is very alarming. And what we found on the island was what these birds were bringing back. So albatrosses naturally will feed on fish eggs and squid. And a lot of the fish eggs are sort of an oily substance, and they'll naturally cling to a hard substrate. And sometimes that hard substrate is wood or pumice. And albatrosses actually have a natural way to regurgitate these indigestible pieces, such as a squid beak or a piece of wood, where they regurgitate sort of like an owl's pellet. And in this pellet, it's called a bolus for an albatross, you'll find these squid beaks and other pieces of natural material. Unfortunately today, and the statistics are staggering at the number of little bits of plastic pieces that you also find that were in the gut of these birds. This trash is not only brought in from the birds, but it's also ocean-based coming in with the currents. And I know, Marcus, this is a specialty. We'll talk about the currents in the Pacific Gyre and how, given certain conditions, these currents will deliver hundreds and thousands of pounds of this marine debris, in which a large percentage of it is made up of plastic. We found a lot of debris underwater too, and NOAA is one of the leading agency that is leading the removal of this marine debris from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. In fact, they even use spotter planes. And once, unfortunately, when this netting of all different material, Marcus was so kind to bring in some samples, but this is just a variety of all the different types of material that's found within the fishing gear. And a lot of this gear, the fishermen will lose them accidentally in storms and stormy conditions, and a lot of it might even be cut off because it gets snagged or entangled. It's just as easy to cut it off and discard it, unfortunately. And I think that's sort of the out of sight, out of mind mentality. And what we have seen around these islands is when you get thousands of pounds of this netting, this nylon and monofilament netting that comes into the contact with the coral reef, it's completely devastating to the coral reef environment. Coral itself is so fragile, so when you get this very heavy nylon netting that gets entangled within the fragile pieces of the hard coral, it just breaks it apart. When we were at Midway Island, there was a team, a volunteer team of young college students that have devoted their summer to removing the net around a couple of the atolls in the northwest part of the chain. And this was where they were accumulating it at Midway, and then it was shipped back down to Honolulu. But in the short time that we were there, This was over 80 tons of net that was removed in less than a month's period of about a dozen volunteers free diving removing this. So it was a really good eye-opener for us of the detrimental damage being done by this discarded net. In the last 10 years, 560 tons of marine debris has been removed from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and it's finally getting international recognition. Deborah back here has some wonderful literature and a nice little educational poster if we have any teachers in the audience or anybody who wants to take a poster home about this marine debris and the entanglement of not only coral reef species, but also the larger marine mammals and, of course, seabirds. But Jean-Michel Cousteau, when he came back from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, he really knew that we cannot just attack the industry industry that's creating this material. We are the consumers. We are the one that are purchasing it. He really feels it's an individual responsibility, and that's where we devote a lot of our energy and efforts, is in the educational opportunity. We do work with different industries. We try to come up with creative solutions to attack or to come up with some solutions to some of this major problems of marine debris. One of the best days of Jean-Michel's life that he always mentions is the day that he was invited to the White House in April of 2006. And it was the same day that our PBS special Voyage to Kure was airing for the first time on PBS. Jean-Michel Cousteau was invited with Dr. Sylvia Earle, the governor of Hawaii, and a handful of other people, plus 80 other people, to a private screening of Voyage to Kure. And President Bush was in awe of the beautiful high-definition footage of the coral reef environment, the fragility of these islands, but he was also just struck in awe about the mounds and mounds of marine debris that was documented on these islands. President Bush, in a very short 2-month period, less than 2 months, in the beginning of June of 2006, made an executive order and created the largest marine protected area with just the signature of his name. These islands were undergoing a process of becoming our 14th National Marine Sanctuary, and President Bush made the decision to even put down a higher protection status as the newest marine national monument. And today it's the largest marine protected area, bigger than the Great Barrier Reef, and it's even larger than all of our national parks together. So it's a quite an exciting declaration by President Bush, and he really was inspired by Jean-Michel Cousteau and the footage that we brought back. And we don't expect all of our films to have such a powerful influence, but we know that the importance of nature documentary, and we know the importance of doing our best to document what we do witness in some of these remote areas. And that brings us back to the local level and our involvement here in the Santa Barbara community. It really happens at the individual level, and being based here in Santa Barbara gives us an opportunity to really have an emotional connection to our community and really reach out and try to provide the resources and the educational opportunities that give us the tools and the resources to make the proper decisions. We have a very large Ambassadors of the Environment, hands-on educational environment program, outdoor environmental education program. Karen Keltner is our director of our Ambassadors program, and here in Santa Barbara is just one of many locations that we have these ambassador programs. And as the name implies, we really look at the next generation as our leaders of tomorrow and empowering them to make the decisions, the proper decisions, to ensure a sustainable future. Here up at El Capitan and some of the great resources that all the other great organizations in Santa Barbara provides gives us an opportunity to bring in the watershed connection. And not only do we teach the valuable connection that we all have to the natural environment, but also the connections between the land and the sea. And we know that most of the marine debris out floating in the middle of the Pacific is land-based. About 4/5 of the debris out there comes from land. So it comes from our creeks, it comes from irresponsible disposal of trash. And that's where each of us can make a difference. Jean-Michel Cousteau always says the biodiversity is social security. So by protecting just the biological diversity of this planet helps ensure our survival for future generations. And that's really our big message of the Ambassadors of the Environment, is using the marine environment to teach these ecological connections and how we as an individual can make a difference. And thanks to the City of Santa Barbara and the opportunities to get involved, this Saturday, Rise and Shine Early, there's an opportunity to get your hands down in the dirt and on the sand and pick up the trash, because that's really where the difference is. Next slide. slide. So there's a wonderful quote that, if I could say this correctly, a wonderful Native American quote that we, of course, did not inherit the planet from our parents. We are borrowing it from our children. And now that I am a mother and entered parenthood, I really respect the importance that we all have to pass on the responsible lessons that we learn in our everyday life, and knowing that we have a community that is so enriched with opportunities to educate ourselves on how we can get more involved and make a difference. And that's where it is. It's teaching that next generation that we are all part of the solution. So with that, I would like to share with you just a short little clip from our Voyage to Kure DVD. It does continually air on PBS. Voyage to Kure was the first 2 hours that we had on PBS last April of 2006. We also had 2 other hours that aired last July on sharks and on gray whales. And we had 2 hours last fall on the America's Underwater Treasures, which is about our 13 national marine sanctuaries around the country. They do continuously air on PBS, depending on what cable system you have at home. So keep your eyes open for Jean-Michel Cousteau's Ocean Adventures, and you might even catch one of our DVDs or one of our specials. We are right in the heart of production for next year's season, and next April is when we will have our next 2 hours, and it's going to be called Return to the Amazon. So the Cousteau team actually goes terrestrial, and we'll show you the connections between the largest rainforest and our water planet. So what I would like to do, it was really challenging for me to pick out my favorite couple minutes of the Voyage to Kure expedition. It was truly a life-altering experience for me, and as Jean-Michel really feels that we all have the privilege to see one of the most remote island chains and to really better understand our connection to it. So I've picked a short little sequence that shows Jean-Michel Cousteau walking on Lace Sand Island, and I have a map back there, and I know Deborah has a map for the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, so if you wanted to see some of these islands in relation to Midway or to the main Hawaiian Islands, please visit us in the back. But here he is on Lace Sand Island, and you're going to see some of the disturbing debris that we came across, and then it's going to end with just a beautiful dive that we had around Lace Sand Island. And I should say, I'm one of the 2 divers that you're going to see in the footage, and Lace Sand Island, believe it or not, because of all the seabirds, there's a lot of guano on that island, and guano, being fertilizer, is very nutrient rich. So the surrounding coral reefs really close to shore was actually pretty limited in coral growth. And here, we'd been diving some really open water, beautiful reefs and tiny little atolls, and we get to Lace Sand, and we had really high expectations the further northwest we went, and we were pretty shocked that there wasn't a lot of growth on the actual rocky substrate. But what you are going to see is just the abundance of fish life that we did see on every single dive that we had at the northwestern Hawaiian Islands.
Fertile seas in isolation sustain millions of birds in the northwest Hawaiian Islands. But for countless seamen, the rocky and jagged reefs of the island have led to disaster.
I mean, there's nothing worse of a nightmare than to run aground.
But how, so a Japanese longliner?
It appears to be.
So?
You can still see the plating.
Yeah.
Not a good day.
Well, the worst kinds.
Not a good day at sea.
Then, evidence of something more sinister running aground here.
A geological record, if someone came back 10,000 years from now, there's going to be just a very thick layer in the sediments that's just plastic.
Right. When we found out that not only the island is covered with debris which comes from the open ocean, but those debris which we discard everywhere is being picked up by birds who collect them because they are eggs, fish eggs usually, that have been laid on these pieces of plastic. And the parents brings it back to the island and feed their chicks. Lighters coming from all over the world, children toothbrush, adults, mascara, we have toys. We have soldiers. We have vials with still stuff in it. That went into a bird. and back into another bird. Nature can take a lot of punishment. These creatures here are doing unbelievably well when you think what they have to put up with. And at the same time, perhaps too much is too much.
Ironically, the same ocean currents carrying debris to the islands from thousands of miles away also nourish tropical seascapes of extraordinary abundance and beauty.
We had the opportunity to dive with rebreathers, and Matt, my dive buddy here, has a closed circuit rebreather on, which gave us the opportunity on some of these locations to be underwater for 3 hours, as I mentioned. And really what it does is, you can still let it play through the end. It's okay, Liz. Oh, did it just stop? It gave us an opportunity to approach a lot of the wildlife underwater. And in one of our dives, we had a Hawaiian monk seal that came right up towards us. And most of the monk seals on the islands are tagged. They have a little flipper tag on their hind flipper. And this one female monk seal we saw was 030. And we shared that with one of the island biologists. And she was just absolutely thrilled and knew exactly what animal that was. She was over 25 years old. She successfully pups on a regular basis, and she moves back and forth between Midway and Curray. And that just gave us a great idea of really the value and the hard dedication of the people that were working or are working on these islands, and the understanding that we all need to understand our connection to these fragile ecosystems, even though they're thousands of miles away. Jean-Michel, when we departed Hawaii, of course, we got a lot of press from our expedition there. You could go ahead and turn it up. And one of the things that Jean-Michel said that will always stay in my mind and is part of our film is we must restore much of the earth from our impact, but these faraway jewels of the sea will still thrive with life. We need only protect them from human harm and let them be. And that's truly one of the uniqueness of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the newest designation as the largest marine protected area. And with that, we are all a part of the solution, and congratulate all of us just for being here tonight. It's all part of an educational process of learning what we can do to better protect the environment and ensure a healthy, sustainable future for future generations. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Holly. Wow, that was an incredible presentation and video footage and images, and it really does a great job to document how serious this problem has become. And I think we're going to hear some more about how the problem is becoming more and more serious all the times as plastics become more pervasive in our environment. When I hear about 80 tons of fishing nets being collected just in one summer, just in that area, and then Holly mentioned the 4/5, so 80% of the marine debris that is out there in the gyre is coming from land. 80 tons is coming from ships just in fishing nets alone, and that's just part of the 20%. So you can imagine how much debris is actually collecting and gathering out in the water. It's just incredible. That does remind me of something I forgot to mention earlier. Tonight's event is a zero waste event, and I know a lot of you are familiar with the blue barrels that we all use for recycling. You'll see tonight we have some yellow barrels, and the city is trying to institute this at as many events as we can throughout the city. The napkins and cups and plates that we've used tonight are all biodegradable, and if they're placed into these yellow bins instead of into the trash can, they will be composted along with the food waste and will not end up in the landfill or in the ocean. So please, when you're done with your cups, make sure they get into the yellow bins. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Marcus Erickson. the Director of Research and Education for the Algalita Marine Research Foundation. Marcus received his PhD in science education from the University of Southern California in 2003 before embarking on a 5-month, 2,000-mile rafting journey down the Mississippi River on a raft made from plastic bottles. Marcus, I don't think this is the one here, but it was a little larger when you did the Mississippi, right? This experience solidified his commitment to watershed conservation, leading him to the Algalita Marine Research Foundation in Long Beach. As their Director of Research and Education, Dr. Erickson coordinates research projects and expeditions focusing on plastics in the marine environment. He hosts the educational film series, Watershed Wonders, and coordinates the project, Plastics Are Forever, visiting dozens of high schools throughout Southern California to raise awareness about marine debris and what can be done about it. I know he visited with some Santa Barbara students earlier today, and we're very fortunate to be able to hear from him this evening. Please welcome Dr. Marcus Erickson.
Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight, inviting me to Santa Barbara to speak about this issue. I've had a great day today here in Santa Barbara. I got here around 10 o'clock this morning and visited Santa Barbara Middle School to share with them my inspiration for this issue. Back in 2000, I was invited as a teacher chaperone to join a high school in Brentwood to go to Midway Atoll. It's like an amazing opportunity. I said, sure, I'll go. And I picked up all these albatross boluses, like Holly talked about, what the albatross regurgitate, and it was full of plastics. And I was finding albatross carcasses all around with plastics in their chest. And so I brought these boluses back home, and I've had them for years. And thousands of students have looked at them, including the students today, 24 students here in Santa Barbara. And the kids were picking plastic, separating those from squid beaks and bits of pumice and seeds, and looking at what these animals are consuming, recognizing the trash, bottle caps and cigarette lighters as things that we use here in our watershed that end up floating thousands of miles, years later and have an impact on some living things. So students here really enjoy that lesson. Okay, so my talk, back up one slide, please. Okay. It's called Plastics in the Marine Environment. This photograph is from Life magazine, 1955, when plastics first made their way into everyone's house. You had all this research and development during World War II to create plastics for the war effort, to make canteens and plane parts, all this stuff. But after the war, what do you do with all this new technology, all these new synthetic materials? Well, let's just take that and recreate our domestic life. So you can see this family, they're throwing trash in the air. Never wash a dish again. Take the housewife out of the kitchen. That was a slogan used in this article. The next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about plastic production statistics. What you're seeing here is just now it's almost a vertical curve of plastic production in the U.S. If you go back to the beginning, working in World War II, when we first had plastics, in fact, the first plastics in our household were nylon stockings back in the late 30s. But after the war, when we began to introduce all these new products like Tupperware and the hula hoop, all these plastics began to replace the glass and the metal and the paper and the wood. Now today, everything is plastics. You almost can't get away from it if you want to have an average American life. So you can see here, I pulled out these two numbers here, these two dates. So 15 years ago, according to the American Plastics Council, now the American Chemistry Council, we produced 60 billion pounds of plastic. Only 15 years, it's doubled to 120 billion pounds. So next slide, please. So in a throwaway society, where is away? Well, the California Integrated Waste Management Board did a little study back in 2003 to look and see where all that plastic that's produced, where it's going post-consumer. So you can see half of it ends up in a landfill. Half gets buried. 20% becomes durable goods, things like car bumpers and toys and computer parts, things that may end up in a landfill eventually, but this first stage is durable goods. 5% gets recycled. And I'm not sure I'd even use the word recycling for plastics. I'll get into that later. But only 5% ends up going through the doors of a recycling center compared to what actually gets produced in the United States. That leaves 25% unaccounted for. Next slide, please. So where is away? Here is away. The world's beaches, the world's oceans. So we find plastics now in every beach around the world, every beach I go to. I spent a month this summer island hopping in the Caribbean around Trinidad and Venezuela. And there was one stretch of beach, maybe 500 feet wide. I could have picked up 5,000 plastic bottles in a couple hours. Every beach around the world now is full of plastics. Next slide, please. So I gave a talk in Alaska to the Alaska State Senate about 4 months ago. They're trying to pass a bill to levy a 15-cent per bag tax on those T-shirt bags you and I get by the thousands from Ralph's and Albertsons and around town. And the folks were saying, well, Alaska, our beaches are clean. I said, okay, hold on. Let's go for a walk. I took a little quarter-mile walk, and I said, pick up everything you see. Walk up and down the beach, and walk into the brush. Pull out everything, all the shoes and the rope and the styrofoam chunks you find. And we picked up 5 pounds in a quarter mile. Well, Alaska has 33,000 miles of coastline, so that could be 316 tons of plastic. It's always good to hit senators with some local data. Okay, next slide, please. So here's in addition to going to Midway, getting inspired about the issue, when I finished my PhD, I grew up in New Orleans, and I thought, I'll go do the Tom and Huck thing. Because I finished school, I had no job, leave my apartment in an hour if I wanted to, and so I decided to build myself a raft. And it took 5 months to go 2,000 miles from Lake Itasca, Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. Once I got down south of my neck of the woods, I could always look left or right and see plastic. Close my eyes, looking, and there it is. Milk crates and ice chests and bottles and bags. Everything that we use that you might see on the shelves of Walmart was going down our nation's greatest river, longest river, and greatest watershed. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts? We can categorize those into eight categories. One is public perception. This has a huge economic impact. If the public perceives beaches are dirty, which they are around the world, there's less tourism. And there was one study there's one newspaper article in New Jersey years ago talking about medical waste. They lost, the entire tourist season crashed because of that public perception of plastic waste and medical waste being on the shore. Next slide, please. Entanglement, drowning, strangulation, and ghost nets. Ghost nets was this thing that I brought here today, a big tangled mass of nets that you find inside the tentacles of jellies. Lots of marine mammals and sea turtles get entangled. You can see this picture comes from a zoo I used to work at in New Orleans, the Audubon Zoo. That's an alligator snapping turtle that managed to walk into a little bottle cap, or the ring on top of a milk jug, perhaps, and just grew around it. Next slide, please. Ingestion. Plastics, pelagic plastics floating out to sea. It might look like food. It might have fish eggs attached to it. And you're finding more and more that animals are ingesting plastics. Next slide. In fact, 44% of all seabirds have been found with plastics inside their bodies, as well as 26 species of cetaceans, and almost all marine reptiles have been found with plastics, either entangled or ingested. Next slide, please. Hosts for invasive species. As you know, invasives are animals from somewhere else that somehow migrate to our shore, our lakes and rivers and streams and nearshore environment, and they outcompete local species. In the past, animals could cross oceans by riding on logs or coconuts or what have you. And recently, we determined that the ballast water in ships was the biggest culprits for invasives crossing oceans. Now, it's plastic. It's plastic bottles. It takes a year for a plastic bottle to cross from China to the United States. Next slide, please. Persistent organic pollutants. Plastics, as you know, when they're produced, they contain lots of toxins, things like phthalates, bisphenol A, and other plasticides that have detrimental effects to living systems. But when plastics end up in the ocean, they're not just leaching out those toxins, they're also absorbing new ones. And I'll get into what's in the ocean from excessive fertilizers and pesticides, oil drops from cars. These things, they end up sticking to plastics. And I'll get into this a little bit later. Next slide. Benthic interference. Plastics create this impermeable layer that cover the ocean floor. Half of plastics produced, a little more than half, are actually negatively buoyant. styrofoam, for example, polystyrene, will sink. As the cells collapse in the foam, it actually sinks to the bottom. Half of plastics made sink. So if you go swimming around the nearshore environment, like in LA where I live, there's a creek near my house, Bayona Creek, that drains most of downtown LA. You go in that creek, and you will just see layers and layers of plastic bags. You can't even see the sediment. And you pull these bags away, and it's this black benthic ooze, anaerobic. There's no more clams, no more snails, and no more worms living in the sediment. Marine nurseries are impacted. As Holly talked about, the plastics washing up are being carried to some of the islands where these birds are nesting. Next slide. And it's an industrial nuisance. If you're a boater, the last thing you want is a plastic bag covering your intake to cool your engine. When we were last in the gyre 2 years ago, halfway to Hawaii, we're pulling out nets, pulling out this net, and we get news from shore that there's a submarine, this little Russian sub up here, that's stuck on the ocean floor with its propeller tangled in a net. It's becoming an enormous industrial nuisance, among other impacts. Next slide. So, who are we? What is our research? Our foundation, we were founded by Captain Charles Moore. He's the fellow that's here on your right. He's an avid surfer and sailor, grew up in Long Beach, and has seen the ocean from him being a child, when he was a kid, being very clean, no plastic in the ocean, basically, to now being inundated. So he began this foundation about 10 years ago, and his first expedition across to Hawaii to sample was back in 1999, and we published about those findings. I'll share with you in a second. Next slide, please. So, this is an overview of the ocean currents. This was a study done by NOAA years and years ago, a 20-year study where they released all these tracking buoys on the two coasts of the North Pacific. Next slide. So you can see in half a year, as these buoys were transmitting their position, we're getting an idea of where the currents are going. Next slide. So in 1 year, they're halfway across. Next slide. In 3 years, they've already crossed the ocean and they're starting to settle. Next slide. 10 years. Next slide. 20 years. So these tracking buoys gave us an idea of where the currents are going and also where the accumulation zones are. Once stuff gets out into the gyre, where is it staying? You can imagine the gyre being a giant toilet bowl that never flushes. It's going in this clockwise circle with these accumulation zones. Next slide. So our study area is about 1,000 miles due west of here, halfway to Hawaii. We've gone there now 5 times. In fact, Captain Moore just landed in Hawaii after crossing the ocean a month ago to survey how the trend in plastic accumulation is going. Next slide. So in all of our trawls thus far, we have found the most dense concentration of plastics in the heart of that collection zone, which you would expect, but we were able to document that, and that was our published paper. Next slide. So what we do, we use a device we call the Manta Trawler. It has a 90 centimeter wide mouth, 30 centimeters tall, and a long mesh net, a 300 micron mesh net, so it's capturing everything in the ocean surface, the entire biomass except for some phytoplankton and all the plastics. And we're sampling about 30 centimeters deep. And it has 2 wings in it to keep it bouncing on top of the surface. So we drag this net maybe a kilometer or half a kilometer, depends on how dense the debris is on the surface. Pull the net up and put the sample into a jar. And I brought one sample to show you. This is one sample from, this is maybe 90 centimeters by 30 centimeters by maybe half a kilometer. And what you're looking at is a lot of zooplankton floating around. There's a bundle of fish eggs here, there's a small crab, there's a barnacle. The majority of the mass is plastic. There's a plastic pen cap. And once again, this is 1,000 miles out to sea. There are bits of broken string and just hundreds of small pieces of white, blue, green, and black plastic fragments. Fragments and bits of film and bits of line, fishing line. So we take these samples, and we collected maybe 60 of them in our 2005 expedition, and bring these samples back to our lab. We have a small lab and a dedicated group of volunteers, and they'll painstakingly, using tweezers, pull out every single tiny piece of plastic. I can't do it. But they sit there and they just pull out all this plastic. That goes in one pile, and the marine life, that whole biomass of the ocean surface, goes in one pile. And then we dry it out, and we weigh it. And guess which pile weighs the most? Plastic. Guess how much more? Next slide, please. 6 times. There's 6 times more plastic than the entire biomass on the ocean surface. So there's this enormous non-nutritive material that's floating out to sea, that's being filtered out by barnacles and jellies and salps and other filter feeders. So if we consider the size of the North Pacific, it comes about 3.5 million tons of plastic. And this is 1999 data. And as I said, Captain Charles Moore just landed 2 weeks ago, and we were talking a couple days ago about how this trend is increasing, and he was holding a sample while I was talking to him, and I said, okay, what's it like now? Well, without processing it, just guessing, he said, well, now, 8 years later, maybe 100 to 1. That's in 8 years. That's anecdotal. We haven't got that published yet, but the trend is definitely that the debris issue is getting much worse very quickly. Next slide, please. So what happens as these small particles get smaller and smaller? You see, plastic, as you know, doesn't biodegrade, but it does photodegrade. The UV light will break plastic into individual polymers. That takes a while. That takes a while. And it takes much, much longer for UV light to break those polymer chains into smaller fragments, little compounds of carbon. Next slide. What's happening to it, as it gets smaller, it's absorbing those persistent organic pollutants I mentioned earlier. Next slide. I'll actually back up a little bit. You know what a nurdle is? It's these little tiny pre-production plastic pellets. So when we make 120 billion pounds of plastic every year, they start off as these little tiny things called nurdles. Surfers call them mermaid tears. And you find these everywhere. There was one study of plastics washing up in Hawaii. And even though Hawaii makes nothing in plastic, 10% of the debris by count were nurdles. So they're traveling across the ocean. And where are they coming from? Factories that are receiving nurdles as they transport them from the trains or the trucks into their hoppers. Millions fall on the ground. And you can go near the San Gabriel River or anywhere in LA, there are hundreds of these plastic manufacturers, and you watch the nurdles just running down in the storm drain. And you walk on the beach, like in Seal Beach, pick up a handful of sand at the rack line, and you'll find nurdles. I can easily go there in one day or just a couple hours and show people a handful of nurdles. So you can see time at sea, as these nurdles are bobbing around, they're absorbing these persistent organic pollutants. Some will just stick to it, and some will get absorbed into it. Next slide. So the things like PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, organochlorine pesticides, things like DDT and DDD, what it breaks down into, or PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from the incomplete burning of fossil fuels. All these pollutants are around us. We produce them, and they flow through our watershed out to sea. Once they get out there, they're hydrophobic. They don't mix with the water. So they're sort of floating around. When they find plastic, they're lipophilics. They'll stick to that plastic. And it makes that plastic nurdle, or any plastic fragment, as it gets smaller and smaller, these little toxic pills that filter feeders are consuming. Next slide, please. So there's one fellow, Dr. Takata, he studies this phenomenon. He has found that one nurdle have up to 1 million times higher concentration of pollution than the same volume drop of seawater. So they really are these little toxic pills. And what we're trying to figure out now is what happens when those get consumed. Do those toxins migrate from the plastic back into the animal? That's new. We just wrote a proposal to study that just a couple months ago. Next slide, please. So where does this plastic marine debris originate? It's coming from us. And there's a misconception there because I talk to many people and they say, oh, it's the boaters doing it. It's the cruise ships doing it. It's the Navy dumping trash. Most of it's from us. And you can go to almost any river leaving an urban center and wait for the first flush. We just had it down in L.A. about 2-3 weeks ago, the first major rain, and I went down to Bayona Creek, which drains downtown L.A., and the city beat me to it. They had their dump trucks lined up and their crew with pitchforks, and they already filled like 3 dump trucks, already pulled out 40 tons of plastic bottles and bags and styrofoam cups. That's where I went right there, and they were just there, getting rid of it, out of sight, out of mind. Next slide. So we did our own study to see, okay, how much plastic is actually leaving our watershed. So we went to LA River, San Gabriel. Those 2 rivers drain most of the LA County watershed. And we sampled on 3 days. Next slide. So we stuck our Manta Trawler in the water in a couple of different nets, and we sampled a very limited volume of water compared to what was flowing down the river. But we were able to go to the Department of Water and Power and get the data on how much water actually went down those 2 rivers in those 3 days. So we could extrapolate based on the plastic we found how much may have been in the whole river, both rivers, in just 3 days. So next slide. So we sampled on 2 wet days, 1 dry day, and by extrapolating to the actual amount of water that flowed through, we guessed there are probably over 2 billion particles of plastics left Los Angeles, individual by count. By weight, about 60,000 kilograms. Just 3 days in 1 city in the world. Next slide. Where else is it coming from? Plastic manufacturers. You can go sometimes outside their factories where the trains are sort of just stopped and waiting and watch the needles just sort of slip out, little cracks and crevices. And they'll make these little piles of snow, plastic snow, on the train tracks. So what we did, we went to 10 factories and we asked them, okay, we know that the state of California suggests ways to curb the tide of plastics leaving your site. They'll suggest things, next slide. They'll suggest that you sweep. These are all suggestions. They'll suggest that you put these catch basin inserts or put screens on your drains. They're just suggestions. So do you think these companies actually take them? No, because it costs staff time and materials and so forth. So we asked 10 companies, go ahead and just do this for a few months. Let's see what happens. We'll work with you, and we won't mention your name. Just let's see what happens. Next slide. We found a 75% decrease in pellet loss, which of course saves the company materials and saves the long-term cost of all the impacts I talked about the plastics have on the marine environment. Next slide. So we can actually thank the governor for signing Senate Bill 258. Next slide. What 258 does, it curbs the tide of pre-production plastic pellets leaving these factories. It puts teeth in those best management practices that were suggested by the state. Now they're mandatory. So it's going to work. Next slide. Next one. Okay, what's our future research? A few things. The migration of pollutants, future expeditions, global baseline, plastics and sediment. Next slide. Okay, plastic ingestion. Like I said before, we know these pollutants are being sorbed onto plastics. Things are in the ocean, not mixing with water, but sticking to plastic. When that gets ingested, is it migrating back to the animal? There's one study that looks at the Laysan albatross, and we know that PCBs are found in the tissues of albatross. And PCBs are in the plastics in their stomachs. So when we make the correlation, that's where it's coming from. That's where it's coming from. It could be coming from ambient seawater or from the food they're ingesting, but we're guessing it's mostly from the plastics, migration from the polluted plastic into their bodies. But there are other things we want to look at and other organisms. So that's our next step. Next slide. Future expeditions. The Gyre Voyage 2007 just ended. And the next one's going to be the Circum-Pacific journey. It's going to begin this time next year. And Captain Charles Moore is going to go around the entire Pacific Rim, North Pacific Rim. From here to Hawaii, the Hawaiian archipelago, Guam, Japan, the Aleutians, and come back in a year and a half. And just sample the whole Pacific. Just get a good snapshot of what the issue looks like across the entire North Pacific. Next slide. Global baseline. This is kind of fun because I get to travel and get to go see different parts of the world. This is a photograph I took from Hurricane Katrina. I had a chance to get there less than a week after the hurricane hit and took this photo. It's a huge marine debris issue. Next slide. These are two photos I actually took about 6 months ago. These aren't within a week of the hurricane. These are now. So it's still a huge marine debris issue. So what we did, we sampled some of the barrier islands and the river itself, Mississippi, and some of the lakes and streams around the delta looking for plastics. Next slide. We're going to begin a coastal survey of North America, East Coast and West Coast, just sampling the entire coast of the United States on both sides to get a snapshot of the issue around our continent. Next. One of our projects is to go to India next summer and look at the marine debris issue from the shipbreaking industry. This industry is only about 20 years old. There are hundreds of ships being dismantled in developing countries in Bangladesh and China and India. These are ships that can't be used in the U.S. and Europe anymore. They're old, they're defunct, and instead of dismantling them here, where our EPA standards wouldn't allow, or would be very expensive, they're sent to other parts of the world under the impression that they'll be used as a ship again, and they're not. They're dismantled for scrap. They'll take metals, they'll take wiring, some electronics, but the rest of it washes out to sea. There's been one study looking at the sediment in some of these shipbreaking yards, and there was one sample where 10% of the volume was actually man-made materials, asbestos and hydrocarbons and heavy metals and plastic debris. So what we want to do is go there and just trawl near the coast, up and down some of these shipbreaking yards to see what kind of marine debris is floating out to sea. Next slide. One thing I just completed was a pilot study looking at plastics that are negatively buoyant. As I said earlier, half of plastic made actually sinks. So you can find it in the nearshore environment and our rivers, streams, lakes, and estuaries. Next slide. So I went to the 3 rivers that drain LA County, Bayona Creek, San Gabriel, and Los Angeles, went to where the concrete bottom ends. As you know, the rivers down south, they're concrete lime, the sides and the bottom, almost the entire river. But right where it ends is sediment for about 3 miles to get to the mouth of the river, right, the ocean. So within that 3-mile section, I was sampling, but I went right to where the concrete bottom ends. And I was finding all kinds of evidence of an urban watershed. Like I found a handful of bullets in Bayona Creek, pocket knives, all kinds of things, and lots of plastic. Next slide, please. So in the samples I got, 60 liters of sediment. I pulled out 28 grams. If I extrapolate that to be a cubic meter, it comes to 474 grams, roughly a pound of plastic for each like washing machine sized block of sediment. A pound of plastic. Next slide. So considering that these 3 rivers are 3 miles of sediment where the plastic can accumulate, as wide as they are, I figured I had about a square kilometer of area. Based on that estimate, a pound per cubic meter, going down 10 centimeters, a rough estimate is that there's about 46,000 kilograms of plastic just sunk in those rivers leaving Los Angeles. That does not include the nearshore environment. I stopped right at the beach. I didn't go further. Now, divers have told me anecdotally there's tons of trash right there at the mouth. So this pilot study, we just wrote a proposal to do a much more exhaustive study to collect much more sediment to get a much better idea of what's in sediment. Next slide. Okay, solutions. Next slide. Okay. Recycling should really be called downcycling, or one generation of reuse, or one step away from the landfill. If you consider how we recycle glass and metal, you can melt down a bottle and make a bottle again, a glass bottle. You can melt a can, aluminum can or a metal can, and make a can again. You can't do that for plastic. It gets contaminated so easily by other kinds of plastics or food waste that it's cost prohibitive to make a polyethylene bottle back into a polyethylene plastic bottle. It's just not done. What it's made into are things like fake lumber, carpeting, fleece clothing, and those things aren't recycled. Those aren't reused again. Those into the landfill. So And also, only 5% ends up going through the doors of recycling centers anyway. This is an example of the post-consumer fix-it. That doesn't seem to work. Next slide. Structural controls. Lots of urban centers put booms across rivers to capture trash, or they'll put screens over their storm drains. Those are effective, but once again, it's a post-consumer solution. Next slide, please. One thing that I've seen work is retail source reduction, banning some of those disposable plastics. I mean, if plastic, if it's not really recyclable, why are we still using it? It never goes away. It's here forever. I think the age of disposable plastics is over. All the bags and the bottles and the cups that we consume, there's no place for it. So this is one strategy that's working. Next slide. And there's commercial source reduction. Trying to reduce, as we talked about, nurdles being lost into the ocean. Next. Beach cleanups and reef cleanups, once again, it's a post-consumer solution that I don't think works. You have to get it before it's being introduced to the environment. Next slide. Bioplastics. It doesn't address overconsumption. I'd hate to see 120 billion pounds of oil-based plastics getting replaced by 120 billion pounds of bioplastics. And of all the studies I've read so far, bioplastics do not degrade well in the marine environment. They require a very warm, wet, microbe-rich environment. Even your home compost is not going to break down bioplastics as efficiently as the companies might say they do. You have to chip it, first of all, to increase the surface area of the plastic fragments. That helps tremendously. It is a lesser of evils. I know that we have some bioplastic products here. That's much better than the oil-based stuff. That's never going to go away. In the marine environment, though, bioplastics, they persist. One thing that we're doing is another pilot study looking at bioplastics, how they degrade if they're buried in a compost, if they're put on top your roof. And then one place we're going to put bioplastics is in the water, in full sun, in the water in full shade. So we're doing this study right now to really see how bioplastics degrade. There's not much literature out there, but everyone's now buying bioplastic thinking it's a solution. Next slide. Public education and consumer responsibility. Public ed is the thing that I like the most. I enjoy building these plastic bottle boats and getting kids all excited about this issue. So up here, this is our founder, Captain Charles Moore, talking with Arnold Schwarzenegger about plastics. And he actually developed he created the Ocean Protection Council, and some of those bills that have been passed to curb the tide of plastics out the marine environment were his doing. So he's really done a lot of work on stemming the tide of marine debris. Down here, this is a boat, which is right here in front of the screen. It's called the Kola Kayak. I work with a school called the Environmental Charter High School. We began a project called Plastics Are Forever. And our first project was to build first thing we did was sample the sand on the beach, look for plastics and do a whole paper, which we gave to the City Council of Lawndale. Then the kids thought the next year, let's do something big. So they built this ship that floated on 800 2-liter bottles, and we launched that ship in 2005 here in Santa Barbara. And we sailed it to San Diego. And we stopped in 11 ports, went to 14 schools, 2 maritime museums, 2 aquariums. We just met thousands of people. Many students and the public got a lot of awareness around this issue. And then the kids were so inspired that last year they built 3 more boats. One they called the Barbie Chopper. It was this bike modified with had 4 pontoons full of plastic bottles and a Barbie head on the handlebars. They had that, and they had one that took a wooden pallet and put basketballs under it. You find like all these balls in the LA River that kids are losing down storm drains. And then there was this one, the Kola Kayak. And they got 2 council members from LA City Council to come down and watch them launch these boats in Bayona Creek, where all that trash in the previous picture you saw. And these kids were like telling these council members, blah, 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 about plastics. It was fantastic. And the Sundance Film Channel came to film these students for a documentary. So it amazes me what just a few inspired students can do. Like, citizens are so powerful when they get out there and actually do something. It makes a huge difference. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, that's the boat. That's Fluke. 800 bottles, floats that thing. You can see there's some rope holding the sail that's made from 3,000 plastic bags braided to make rope, and the sail itself is made from 50 polyester shirts in their parents' closets. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay, that is a lot of information, and I'm sure that people have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask Holly to come back up, and why don't we? Jessica Sheeter has a microphone over here. So if people have questions, why don't you raise your hand, and we can bring a microphone by to make sure everyone can hear the question.
Question?
Thanks. Is it called photodegrading when the plastic is degraded by heat or sun?
That's by the sun, but by UV light from the sun, we call that photodegrading. Yes.
Okay. So does the lower grade plastics that are made from recycled plastics, does that photodegrade more easily than the original plastic? In other words, will that break down easily since that's all that can be done with the plastics?
Would it break down more easily? Photodegradation works if you have the plastic exposed. And when you take the plastic and you remanufacture that to make carpeting or fleece or this fake lumber, if there's enough of it exposed and little chips and particles, that might degrade faster. But I would suspect that would make much of a difference, whether it's being downcycled to another product. I don't think it would matter much.
I was just thinking about it for building materials, or roofing or something like that.
What I wanted to mention was that you have stuff that you can't see. You can see the bottles because they're quite visible. But actually the sewer plants are putting out what you can't see in literally millions of tons added to the toxins that are coming out. And in answer to her question about roofing, you will not be able to get insurance for your house if you put that stuff on, because it creates such a toxic material when it burns that the fire departments won't even respond.
Hi, yes. With the North Pacific gyre, is it gyre or gyre, by the way? Okay. The last study, they said that was the size of Texas, I believe. And this new study, that makes it about 800 miles away from California, where the one perimeter is. When you were taking those samples and you had your solution of what you were finding, does that come anywhere within that entire perimeter of the pollution accumulation? Say we said it was the size of Texas and still growing. Those samples, wherever you took them, is that solution 6-to-1 as it was coming from anywhere in that whole region?
Yes. So I showed from the slide that the North Pacific gyre is from the entire Pacific is this rotating mass of water. It's called the doldrums. There's no currents on the inside. There's no wind. We're finding that now is becoming more and more. There's more plastic accumulating across the entire gyre. The thing that we call the size of Texas, that was what we call the eastern garbage patch, the easternmost edge of the gyre where we were studying, where we thought, okay, that's the accumulation zone, that's where it is, as big as Texas, and that's where it's limited. But now we're finding it's everywhere. It's further south, below Hawaii. It's all the way from here to Japan. So what was the size of Texas, the eastern garbage patch, is now encompassing the entire gyre region. But last decade, yeah. That sample that I showed you is from the center of the eastern garbage patch, halfway from here to Hawaii. That was a dense accumulation zone that I showed. Those tracking buoys where they were accumulating after 20 years, that's what we call the eastern garbage patch, the biggest Texas, that's where this comes from. But now it's the entire gyre itself.
I have first kind of a comment that'll lead into a question, but I don't think anyone's here from Environmental Services for the city. But actually, a group of students brought to the City Council a proposal to ban the use of styrofoam and to-go containers in restaurants. And it's now in ordinance meetings, and it's moving quite close to basically going towards all compostable containers for to-go containers in restaurants. And we're even kind of steering away from hard plastics and going towards compostables. And one of the challenges is restaurant owners are a bit afraid of the increased cost that might affect their business. So the comment is for those of you who live in Santa Barbara is to be vocally supportive of this transition with restaurant owners so they feel confident that they won't lose business as a result of it or lose profit. But then the thing that's coming into this is the devil's in the details. The plastics derived from corn do break down quite a bit less in the marine environment. They can contaminate plastic recycling streams. For example, if you put it into, accidentally throw the corn-based plastics into a plastic recycling bin, it can actually ruin the entire amount for recycling. They won't do it. And so there's a lot of need right now for information on what are the best choices to go towards to get rid of the plastics and the styrofoam. And I know you're going to do some work on this, but are there any suggestions you have for people in a community that are looking to get rid of plastics and to-go containers and also eventually potentially plastic bags in grocery stores? Are there some good options out there that you've seen or done research with that would work?
The option I always say is bring your own. I mean, don't be ashamed to bring your Tupperware container or another kind of container. Habit, I guess. To a restaurant to get your leftovers to bring home. It might seem kind of strange, but it's an alternative. At least you can bring your own bag to the grocery store. You can bring your own coffee cup, your own mug, your own thermos bottle, stainless steel. That's one alternative you can do personally. We did fine not using plastic 50 years ago. We had no problem using other materials, bringing our own bags. My grandmother had her own sack she always brought to the store. It was just second nature. You go in the store, grab your bag and go. It's an easy habit, and it takes just a few weeks to get into the habit of doing that. So I think first just have the ban. We'll figure out how to deal with it very quickly, I'm sure. But as far as alternatives to what we're currently using, that this is still staying within our consumptive framework. There's some easy compostable materials like bagasse, which is made from sugarcane fiber. There's a lot of that available to make this very quickly biodegradable material that can replace the to-go containers that we currently use in styrofoam and other plastics. So ban first, and we'll find alternatives quickly, I'm sure.
A lot of plastic used in the medical industry. What would be alternatives for creating different things used for, like respirators or for containers used to hold the medicine? Because wouldn't that plastic become too contaminated to recycle into something else because it is in contact with almost toxic waste?
I haven't thought a lot about that. My brother, who's a nurse, I remember he and I had a conversation. He said, you know what? We throw away so much hazardous waste. We burn, I don't know how many tens of tons every day in the hospital he worked in. Alternatives, I guess go back to glass. We could do that. But I know he said that they go through thousands of latex gloves every day, synthetic latex, and all the tubing and the IV bags, all that. I'm not sure. Perhaps there are some bioplastic alternatives for that stuff, and that's a lesser of evil. Yes. And those biohazardous wastes get incinerated. Oh, sure. I'm sure they have scrubbers that contain a lot of it, but there's lots of dioxins that are leaving the smokestacks, I'm sure. There always are.
You kind of answered my question already in terms of just saying, ban it first and we'll figure out, I guess, ban first and ask questions later or something like that. But along the lines of the the NERDL bill, that 258 that was signed into law, what's the next piece of legislation or legislative concept you see statewide that gets you the most fired up in terms of the next step for addressing marine debris here in California?
I think dealing with the bans locally, like in Los Angeles, just 3 months ago, I sat in for the LA County Board of Supervisors set up a meeting for stakeholders to talk about whether we want to have a county-wide plastic bag ban, just what to do. And the plastics industry, including the Progressive Bag Alliance, which is 3 industries that made this one front for their business, they've got the slickest lawyers that just come there and just argue on their behalf. What they end up doing is getting, I forget the name of the bill, Force. Well, it was this one bill that got passed that required that any store that has more than 10,000 square feet, a grocery store or a department store, they have to have plastic bag recycling bins. And it's frustrating because I know that is just, that's what the industry wants, is they want to pawn the responsibility onto the consumer. You bring your bags and you recycle them back at the grocery store. We're going to keep on making them, but by the trillions annually. You deal with the waste after we give it to you. And that happens all over. Like when I was in Alaska, the industry was there, right behind my back. I gave my spiel, and they walk up and they give theirs. And they do something interesting that we call manufactured uncertainty. They have their own research. Have you heard of bisphenol A? Bisphenol A is the building block of polycarbonate plastics. There's tons of research out there to show that bisphenol A, it's in those Nalgene bottles that we drink, those sports bottles, and little baby bottles. Bisphenol A, we know, is an insulin inhibitor. We know that it's an estrogen mimic, so it feminizes males. Like in studies of rats and mice, you'll have super females full of eggs that are deformed, and males that have low sperm counts and small testicles. It's an insulin inhibitor resulting in diabetes in studies of rats and mice. So we know it's bad stuff. Well, this one researcher, University of Missouri, Dr. Baum-Saul, he did a meta-analysis, looked at all the research out there on bisphenol A, like 115 studies. Of all the studies done by universities and independent labs, rigorous scientific studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals, there was over like a 95% correlation of bisphenol A to the negative impacts on living systems, living tissues. The other, like 15 studies, were done by the plastics industry, published in their own journals, and they found 0 effect of bisphenol A on living systems. Well, what happens, that data gets presented to senators, like what happened when I was at the California State Senate like 4 or 5 months ago, arguing on some of these bills. One bill, 899, on toxins. And I mentioned bisphenol A. Then I sat down. And here comes the industry guy behind me. And he spent his whole talk was on bisphenol A. And he was just giving out little bits of information, referencing his own studies. And it creates this manufactured uncertainty. So these senators, who are the ones who are passing or failing these bills, they think, well, you know what? These guys aren't sure. They don't know yet. We need to do more research and then come back to me with something conclusive. There's one slick way of sort of keeping the flow of plastics going.
It's got to be kind of obvious when they're using, their own studies, though, if to the representatives or whoever is, going over the evidence, if they just check to see who's funding the studies, it would be obvious, the conflict of interest.
You would think it was, but it's not that obvious. Like this same Senate panel I spoke to, there was one senator, he looked at me and said, my constituents are in Lancaster. We have nothing to do with the ocean. It's like, well, come on. Dude, your plastic's going down.
Their campaigns.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, like Holly said, San Francisco just banned plastic bags from the entire city.
Yeah, I think, as you said, a certain size of the stores, the larger stores had a ban.
Yeah.
Smaller.
Is there any,
Ma'am? The plastic bags?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. You use a paper bag that is just as environmentally degrading as you can actually have. But there are statistics against the amount of paper bags we use. Yeah, sorry. It's sort of a double-edged sword, is paper or plastic. And of course, the amount of paper we use is staggering too, so that's not the solution at all. So as Marcus said, it's bringing our own canvas bags. And I know when I go to Trader Joe's and you bring your own canvas bag, you get to enter a raffle and hoping to win a free grocery spree at Trader Joe's. So those are the incentives that the stores and the consumers have the opportunity to partake in.
is there any entirely clean, safe, closed-loop system for destroying plastic, whether it's microorganisms or scrubbers like you were talking about?
No, there isn't. Some folks argue that you can burn it as fuel and make power, but in any power plant is going to produce some level of output of toxins. It's just always that way. So there is no closed loop, no completely closed loop for plastics. It's always going to be around. It doesn't get burned. Yes.
One more question. With those nurdles, you were called nurdles, right? And anyway, how long have they been in production? We know plastics since World War II, but when have these become the big problem they are now? When did they start?
I'm not sure when we began making nurdles. Perhaps from the beginning, when we first began mass producing plastics, the easiest way to transport them is a small grain size. I'm not sure when that started. Probably 1950s when we're mass producing stuff. When did they become a problem? From day one. When did we notice it? Just in the last 10 years. Just the last 10 years. Yes.
So if plastics, the basic building block for plastics is oil, I wonder if there's going to be an increase in cost of plastics as the price of oil increases, and if that might affect production and make other alternatives more competitive.
Sure, I think so. Yeah, as oil becomes more pricey, as you know, plastics are synthesized, they're polymerized from oil. Once you take away all the volatiles, all the gas and the fuel and other things, what's left behind, you polymerize it and make plastics. Once that gets more pricey, of course, plastics will get pricier. But we have to stop using it now. I mean, to see the ratio 6 to 1 8 years ago, now being maybe 100 to 1 is not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. Like the quote you said, we borrow. What was that quote? It sounded good.
The earth from our grandparents are bought it from our kids.
Yes. So what kind of legacy are we leaving behind if we're just over-consuming so much? We're leaving behind a really trashed world. Just not right. And we have to end, like I said, the age of disposable plastics, it's over. It's just getting everyone to understand the science behind it and support these bans, support these changes, and get the industry to back off. And that's the fight we're in right now.
Okay, can I get a round of applause for our guests tonight? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. I guess, once again, we're reminded that the solution to pollution is not dilution. And, you know, it's all of these environmental problems are very, very complex to solve, especially in the long term. And obviously, we don't have all of the answers right now. There are things we can do to stem the tide a little bit in the very short term, and those things are easy. I mentioned earlier that the Creeks Division, with help from a number of local groups, including the Santa Barbara Channel Keeper and Environmental Defense Center, Community Environmental Council, Innovo Energy Solutions, and the Ocean Conservancy, have been working to clean all the trash out of our major creeks in the city before our first storms hit and wash it all out into the ocean. And I wanted to show you some photos of just some of what we've been able to accomplish in just a couple of days. I mean, this is pretty easy work to do right here in the community. This is a cleanup we did on Sycamore Creek. There were about 6 or 7 people. We did it about a half a day, and we pulled a full dumpster worth of trash out of the creek. And I'm not talking about one of those little dumpsters. I'm talking about the big, giant roll-away dumpsters. In the next slide, we did the same thing just last week in Arroyo Burro. And as you can see, we almost had the dumpster filled there again. And I have to tell you, for me personally, it's great to spend a day walking down in the creek and taking that out and knowing and having the satisfaction that, you know, when it rains, that's not just washing right out into the ocean. Last week, the Community Environmental Council organized creek cleanups in all of the creeks down in Carpinteria. These are some pictures from Franklin Creek. They pulled dozens of bags of trash out of the creeks. And then the next slide, and this is great. We've been able to involve a lot of the youth in the community. We had over 30 local teenagers from the Youth Cinemedia program and the City Housing Authority's Splash to Trash program go into local creeks leading up to Creek Week this week. Just this past Tuesday, they were up cleaning up Lighthouse Creek up on the Mesa. So far, just as a part of these few cleanups, we've pulled over a ton of trash out of the creeks. And Marburg is weighing all that for us, and we're well over a ton in just a couple of days. So I wanted to let everyone know that coming up this Saturday, we've got a number of creek and beach cleanups that are being sponsored by a number of local organizations in town. All of this information is on the website you see down here at the bottom. It's also available on the blue handouts, the blue paper handouts that we had tonight. So if you didn't grab one of those on the way in, you can grab one on the way out. And I'd really encourage all of you to participate in those. It's a great experience, and every little bit makes a huge difference. So I hope you'll be able to make it. And lastly, on behalf of the Creeks Division and our co-sponsors tonight, the Santa Barbara County Project Clean Water, I wanted to thank our speakers and thank all of you for coming out. Good night.